McFarland to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Pro-Rector, highly esteemed members of the Corona, distinguished members of the academic community, colleagues, fellow students, friends, and family. Thank you for joining me today virtually. My name is Gillian McFarland, and I'm pleased to share with you an overview of my recent research on the topic of policy enactment in further education colleges in England. My research focuses on the concept of enactment, which is the process by which policies become interpreted and translated from a written text into an action. So how they become something in real life. As a civil servant working at the Department for Education in the UK government, I've observed firsthand the important role and impact that this policy plays, that this process plays in policy making and delivery, particularly in neoliberal policy systems, such as further education in England. However, despite its importance, I was surprised at the relatively limited attention and awareness that this concept of enactment receives, both in academia and at the political executive, sector, and local levels of policy development and implementation. And so this curiosity inspired my research in the area. To explore the topic further, I concentrated on the English education context, and specifically on a relatively understudied phase and setting within that of further education, which is equivalent to what other systems might refer to as the upper secondary vocational stream. This track typically delivers practically focused education for young people in the final stages of their secondary education career. In England, this is for young people aged 16 to 18, who typically have a lower attainment profile from earlier education stages. Within this, I focus explicitly on the enactment of a single policy, and one which is particularly controversial and common in further education settings. It is a standards-based, high-stakes policy that, since its introduction in 2015, has required low-attaining students to continue to study some form of maths and English in their 16 to 18 education stage. Because of the name and of the course most commonly offered to students and the frequency of examination entries, the policy is anecdotally known in the sector and the media as the GCSE, or General Certificates of Secondary Education, resits policy. I chose to focus on this area because of its relative importance, combined with the fact that relatively few academics have looked at this topic of resits before, or extended the concepts of enactment into the further education setting. The overarching question guiding my research is an adaptation of Stephen Ball, Meg Maguire, and Annette Brown's seminal work in this field, looking at enactment in the school system in the early 2010s. My research asks from the overarching critical perspective, how do colleges do policy? 3 sub-questions underpin this. First, what are the underlying cultural institutions that frame the enactment of the GCSE resits policy? Second, how is this resits policy enacted? And third, why does enactment occur in this manner? 3 strands of literature and theory framed my research. First, and as a broader frame, I draw on the wider governance literature, and specifically the notion of sociological institutionalism. Under this framing, culture is positioned as a key force that shapes behavior. Actors seek to act in an appropriate manner, influenced by formal and informal rules, procedures, norms, and scripts. Second, the research uses specific theories linked to the concept of enactment, particularly in the context of education policy. It takes and tests the applicability of various existing tools, such as the notion that certain types of context, roles of actors, and types of policy influence how policies become enacted. The final strand of literature that was instrumental was that of the education policy literature. Specifically, the position that high stakes and standards-based policies can often produce a range of unintended negative consequences alongside positive and intended effects, and linking to education enactment research, relatively passive or similar types of enactment across different settings. To answer these questions, I used a qualitative method and drew on a range of sources from different parts of the wider policy network to do so. This included at political executive level from government ministers, expert advisors and officials, at sector level, including sector representative organisations and externals, and at local level with college leaders, teachers and students from a range of further education colleges. A variety of information from these three levels was collected and analysed. An initial document review and fact-finding survey with officials and sector members helped shape the focus of the research. This was followed up by in-depth historical document analysis and interviews with a range of political executive and sector stakeholders. More detailed observations were then sourced from a number of field visits. There, I used a range of techniques and conducted interviews with members of staff, held focus group discussions with students, reviewed curriculum plans, and observed lessons. My research produced a range of findings, some of which confirmed and strengthened the existing literature, testing its applicability in a new context, and others of which offered fresh, descriptive and explanatory insights into this important policy area and context. Turning to the first question. The study observed a continuum of change in recent decades in terms of approaches to address the challenge of helping students improve their skills in the key subjects of maths and English, particularly in terms of the balance between local and central control of study expectations and professional autonomy. My research shows that policies and stakeholders loosely aligned themselves along what I termed a continuum of underpinning cultural scripts. These are scripts of academic standards and earned autonomy, and vocationalism with assumed autonomy. And these values and beliefs, as indicated with sociological institutionalism theory, influence how stakeholders ultimately acted. The second research question asks how the modern day research policy is enacted. The research observed a disconnect between policy text and policy action. In the large part, I found that translations were relatively performance-oriented, which meant that actors translated the policy in a way that focused on enrolling nearly all students for GCSE courses only, re-entering them on a regular basis for examinations, and adopting a pedagogy that focused on teaching to the test. These translations were made despite not being formally required by the policy text, and alongside a high level of actor dissonance or disaffected consent, and a range of unintended and negative consequences for students and sector professionals, alongside intended and positive consequences. Yet, despite these dominant and typical translations, atypical translations did exist, and these offered a less performance-oriented and a more creative approach for interpreting the policy text, and they focus less explicitly on pursuing performance measures. For example, in these translations, stakeholders interpreted the policy in a way that did not require all students to enroll in GCSE courses only, or to enter for examinations on an annual or twice-annual basis. The final question asked why enactment occurred in this manner. The research found that the complexity of the wider environment in which actors situated themselves was a key factor in explaining why certain policy translations emerged. In particular, the structure of the further education network played a significant role in reinforcing how certain messages were taken up and transmitted, ultimately influencing translations by shaping actors' access to and confidence in the wider range of information with which to make translations. And critically, that out of a fuller contextual dimensions framework proposed in the literature, two key areas emerged as having particular influence over local level translations. That of external contexts, particularly the perceived pressure of Ofsted, which is the English inspection body, and that of professional cultures, particularly cultural positioning and leadership. In addition, the role of students themselves in shaping enactment emerged as a new category to augment the existing contextual framework in the literature. As well as expanding these empirical tools, the study proposes a new concept to help us understand the idea of enactment, that of bounded enactment. The existing literature suggests that imperative or standards-based policy may produce passive forms of enactment, and other policies more creative forms of enactment. But the atypical forms of enactment found in this study suggest that this is not necessarily universal. Instead, the findings suggest that enactment can be seen as occurring within boundaries, some of which are fixed and absolute, and others of which are relative and at times partially constructed by local level stakeholders because of the contextual pressures that they face and their sociocultural experiences and orientation. The study's findings and explanations must be interpreted alongside its limitations and broader implications. It is important to note that this study did not set out to evaluate the effectiveness of the resets policy, and nor can its findings be seen as fully generalizable for enactment across different settings. However, it is pertinent to note the key contributions of the research, some of which, with further application, could contribute to an even greater expansion of knowledge in this area. First, the study offers a fresh empirical insight into a relatively understudied area. Second, it does this by testing the applicability of various theoretical tools and expanding them where necessary, such as in my work on actor typology and contexts. And third, by expanding the wider explanations around the very concept of policy enactment, in particular, the introduction of the notion of bounded enactment. Finally, to turn to the study's recommendations. As outlined in the beginning of this presentation, this research was inspired after observing a disconnect between policy texts and policy actions. In the case of the GCSE resets policy, my study showed that in some cases, this disconnect could have a negative impact on students and staff. My recommendations from the study on the need for improved awareness of the influence of context, for stronger and clearer communication across the policy hierarchy, for an increased focus on leadership, and for improved accountability systems have already been shared with and partly taken up by the Department for Education, both in relation to improving this policy itself and more broadly in helping to train policymakers and members of the sector in how to be more aware of the concept and role of enactment in the policy process, all with the ultimate aim of improving the design and delivery of key public services, such as further education. This concludes the presentation of my research. Thank you for your engagement in my work, and I will now hand back over to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you very much for a clear presentation. The opposition will be started by Professor Dr. Wim Groot, who is Professor of Evidence-Based Education at Maastricht University and who was the chair of the Assessment Committee. The floor is to Professor Groot.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector, the candidate. Let me start by congratulating you on a very nice achievement. I've read your dissertation with great interest, and my overwhelming impression of your dissertation is that it's a thought-provoking work. It's a bit unorthodox in its approach and methods, but probably also because of that, you come up with some very interesting insights and conclusions that I think enrich our understanding in how in the unintended consequences that you sketch of, I think, mostly well-intended policies. I think that is definitely deserves the merit that you hope to will receive at the end of this academic session. I want to discuss with you about actually the main stakeholder that was absent, that is absent from your dissertation, namely those who devised the policy, the politicians. As I said, I think these policies about standards of literacy and numeracy are well intended and intend to developed based upon the concern about the declining literacy levels or the lack of literacy and numeracy among young adults. I was wondering, and I would like to hear your thoughts about that, how politicians would have assessed the unintended consequences of these policies that you sketch in your dissertation. What actual conclusions would they draw from this? Would the conclusion be that they, as politicians, have made some errors in devising this policy? Would they have to conclude that it's no good to develop standards for literacy and numeracy levels for young adults? Or would they rather conclude that it's obstruction by educationalists and teachers that has led to these adverse effects of these policies? I would appreciate your reflections on that. And secondly, one of your recommendations is that a greater attention should be paid to professional cultures in developing policies. And I was wondering whether this isn't rather contradicting with the enactment of the policies that you sketch in your dissertation. Isn't it rather that the politicians want to set these norms and standards for, in this case, by these tests for literacy and numeracy, because they think there is a lack of professional culture and there's a lack of standard among teachers and educationalists, and that they want to impose a basic or a minimum standard that they think young adults need in order to be able to participate in society. And that your recommendation that you have to pay attention to these professional cultures, whatever they may be, is rather worsening the situation rather than contributing to the solution of this of the basic problem, which again I think is the lack of and the low levels of literacy and numeracy among some young people in education. I would appreciate your reflections on these 2 points.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and also for the opportunity to respond on the 2 points that you raised. First, the point on engagement of political executive actors and their perspectives, and second on the point on professional cultures. I will turn first of all to the first point. Specifically, you asked the conclusions that they would draw and their engagement, how I engage this layer in my research. I was careful to bring in the positions of political executive actors throughout the research, and I sought to bring them in both from how they express policy in written form through analysing government documents from 1944 onwards to see the main arguments expressed that outlined why the policy had changed and emerged. Also to analyse public speeches and statements, including through the parliamentary record Hansard in the UK government, to see how they express their opinions in that form. Also, I interviewed a former Department for Education minister as part of the research, and engaged with officials, including from Ofsted and the Department for Education. So this was the wealth of information that I used to triangulate from this level. It is the question on their perceptions and how they would perceive the policy. As I outlined in my research, and I think I gave some direct quotes as well, there was a disconnect, and this is why one of my recommendations links to communication and understanding different positions across the policy hierarchy. Certain actors at political executive level had the perception that local level stakeholders, in this case further education colleges, had more freedoms or had more choices than they felt that they actually did have. So this meant that the government stakeholders, maybe from the position of as I was approaching it as an independent researcher, maybe didn't fully appreciate the contextual barriers and pressures that were faced at local level. And so from my perspective, that was an example of a disconnect. The second question that you asked on professional cultures, I think what I'm trying to get at with this point is on the need to examine the concept of professionalism within further education cultures. It is very different to the school system, in part due to the funding approaches and the way in which policy in recent eras and also historically has made that so. So funding for English and maths teachers is often less in the further education sector than it may be in the school sector. And so as I was finding in my research, many teachers that I interviewed in further education colleges, they might have been agency staff on short-term contracts, maybe only contracted for a couple of months of the year, without permanent repetitive contracts. And so there was certainly a lack of in-depth, in some cases, a lack of grounding in the area. Many of them were not as highly qualified as school teachers of English and maths. So these are the sorts of things that I think with further investment could lead to an improvement, because then teachers would then perhaps be better able to deliver the policy in a way that better met the needs of students.
Yeah, but I think.
I'm very sorry, Professor, because we still need the time to also give the other members of the Degree Committee an opportunity. This will be continued by Dr. Michael Natorsky, who is an assistant professor in governments at this university. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Gillian, my congratulations. It's a great achievement. And thank you very much for your presentation. I have also admit that it has been a great pleasure for me to read your very carefully crafted and executed research. I would like to ask you about very theoretical underpinnings of your research. I would like to ask you a little bit about your reflections and lessons that you could draw from this experience. I would like to ask you about the distinction that you also mentioned at the beginning of your thesis and then come back in the conclusion, that there is a distinction between rational, historical, and sociological institutionalisms. And your research is based on sociological institutionalism. It is usually considered that these three institutionalisms are separated, are different, and they are not very much commensurated. My question is, based and following also your research, could we still, let's say, consider these three different rationalisms, institutionalisms as different types of approaches, or maybe, and this is the question related also to your results and the evidences that you present, whether rational institutionalism is a historical configuration which can be interpreted sociologically, which means that all these three are somehow connected and not very much disassociated. I'm asking whether rationality can be, as it is today understood, can be socially constructed. As you mentioned many times in your research, that there are a lot of social norms. So whether efficiency, instrumental calculus, utility maximization, coercions are in fact social norms, which means that they can be also understood sociologically, not only as something separate from social world. So my question is, as I say, it's about your reflection, about your lessons that you draw from approaching these three different institutionalism, whether these three, they can be still disassociated, whether this distinction is really useful when we approach empirical research, how we distinguish these three institutionalisms in practice, in your empirical evidences. Do you think that it's really useful for future researchers who probably watch us, researchers engaged in other PhD programs? So please tell us what is your lessons and advice, and how would you eventually modify this distinction if you want to think a little bit more theoretically? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and also for giving me the opportunity to reflect on institutionalism. As you mentioned, I adopted a principally sociological institutionalism approach. However, and as you refer to, and as I mentioned in my thesis, these three can link very closely together. But often the distinguishing element is the ingoing perspective that you take. So my research took an ingoing perspective of sociology, or the perspective that above all, that cultures and social positions direct what happens. And this is not to say, and I think many academics kind of have clarified this as well, this is not to say that sociological actors who are acting because of culture cannot be strategic or cannot act because of path dependence, but that the ingoing approach is one of cultures and norms. And certainly I found in my research that strategy or calculus and historical perspectives, they did emerge within the empirical observations as important. For example, colleges sought to make the best use of the funds that they had available. Often they would enter students into these resits because there is no incentive for them to keep them studying, whereas if they entered them and they happened to pass on that occasion, that could be an opportunity for them to move quickly on. And the overall budget that that college receives remains the same. Similarly, from a historical perspective, a position of path dependence was created and certainly is created within the English education system. The very concept of GCSEs or an examination, a centralized examination that all students take, is one that is very hard to get away from in the system. And this is certainly arguably one of the reasons why we face the situation that we do in terms of the policies that are in place at the moment. We know from other research that it's very difficult for employers to recognize other qualifications other than GCSE. And so this leads to this path dependence. And in addition, I think linking to your point, esteemed opponent, my research adopted a constructivist perspective, which took the argument that social realities and positions are constructed in part. And so therefore, as actors would develop their realities and therefore approach the position that they were in, how they then use history and how they use strategy all seem to work together. But that's not to say that the sociological perspective was not important. And in fact, from my perspective, it was important to select one ingoing approach to help guide the research. So I think as a PhD researcher, it made sense to adopt an overarching approach, but potentially in the future, a blend of the approaches or a new institutionalism with a more constructivist perspective could be an option for the future.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Meg McGuire, the third member of the assessment committee. She is Professor of Sociology of Education at King's College London. The floor is yours.
You're on mute, Professor McGuire.
Good afternoon, Gillian, and thank you very much for a wonderful thesis, which was great to read. I want to ask you about some of your theoretical contributions, and I'm very interested, as you won't be surprised to hear, in the notion of bounded enactment. And I wonder where bounded enactment meets some of the atypical or alternative forms that you've found. I'd like you to talk about what you've added to this whole area, and what do you think produces these alternative forms?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment. You asked 3 questions, but I will answer them in combination. Existing research proposes somewhat of a binary, which says the type of policy influences how policies become enacted or delivered on the ground. So readerly policies or more imperative policies produce a passive enactment, and writerly policies or other types of policies, anything that's basically not a standards-based policy or non-imperative policy, produces more creative enactment. And that's a theory that's proposed for schools literature. But when I started testing this in the further education literature, I noticed that I was dealing with a policy, the RESITS policy, that was somewhat of a standards-based policy. And I was noticing that it didn't fit into one of those 2 neat categories, that binary. And so it was from that position of not meeting the binary that I thought, and from my wider reading, I'd come across the notion from Herbert Simon of bounded rationality. And I thought that the vocabulary there was relatively interesting, and this idea of limits. And that got me thinking from my observations and findings that perhaps enactment itself could be positioned as a limited concept and actors acting within the limits that surround them. And that maybe a binary, a readerly and writerly kind of policy shoots almost, was not necessarily the way to approach it based on the findings. And so that's what's the emergence from the literature in terms of what I added. Specifically in terms of bounded enactment and the atypical forms of enactment that I was seeing. I was observing in the majority of cases a very constrained form of enactment, a performance-oriented form, and one that the existing literature would call a readerly form of enactment. But then in the atypical forms, atypical places, I was noticing a much more creative form of enactment, one in which colleges were taking more risks with what they did, where they were not teaching to the test, they were not entering students on an annual resit cycle, they were really kind of trying out different options. And so that in my mind seemed more creative. And so I realized that you could then position this as a bounded form. And actually it was when speaking and linking back to the first highly esteemed opponent, Professor Groot's comment, when speaking to political executive actors as part of the interviews, when speaking to them, I realized that many of them have the perspective that enactment is this wider position. I think the reference to a wider sandbox was used. So actors have all these different options that they can enact within. But then when I contrasted that to the experiences I observed at local level, that's not how local level actors would have perceived themselves and described themselves. They saw themselves as within quite a constrained perspective. And this links to the previous opponent's perspective, that from my perspective, some of those positions were relatively constructed. It was linked to the perceptions of various threats. And so then I thought about this concept of bounded enactment, the boundaries of which I felt some of which were fixed and some of which were absolute. So in the context of the GCSE resits policy, the fixed boundaries were linked to the underlying regulation and legislation, and in general what would be perceived as culturally acceptable overall. But then within that, the more relative boundaries were actually linked then to the wider culture that the college adopted, the positions of leaders and the backgrounds of the teachers themselves, the confidence with which leaders interpreted information, disseminated information, took things at surface value, the confidence with which different types of actors felt that they could explore and take risks. So those were the things that I felt helped to construct those boundaries, which in some cases hemmed some actors in, and in other cases were quite broad and allowed actors space to move and innovate.
Thank you for a very full answer. I think I'm probably out of time.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Marshall, who is a senior lecturer in English education at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy at King's College. And the floor is to Dr. Marshall.
Dr. Marshall, you're on mute.
Thank you very much for letting me read your thesis. I really enjoyed it, particularly the latter half, actually. I thought it was very interesting and very informative, actually. I'm sorry I arrived late. I've just been teaching, and interestingly, I've just been teaching about assessment for learning, which leads me on to my next question. So I'm not going to ask you about the theory of your thesis, which was fascinating, actually. I'm going to ask you practically about the teachers who were actually teaching English and doing all the resets. And you talk a bit about the formative approach that some of them had, and you use the term formative on several occasions. And I was just wondering how both you define formative assessment and how the people that you were interviewing define formative assessment, because it's a very restrictive, time-constrained course. So I was wondering how you thought of it and how they thought of it too.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and also for your question, specifically on my definition of a formative assessment and on how teachers and also students perceived it in the further education colleges that I visited and the teachers that I interviewed. So formative assessment, as I understand, is assessment where that is happening throughout the learning process rather than at the end of an overarching topic, which would be a summative assessment. And in GCSE forms of assessment, under the recently reformed syllabus, there is relatively little formal formative assessment, which would be things like coursework, because that has been removed from the syllabus in 2016. And so it was mostly the learning that was taking place during the lessons. And one of the issues that I observed when I was both observing lessons and talking to people was that students were not necessarily learning. So students were repeating and students were learning how to do answers to the test, but this was not necessarily linked to a fundamental grasping of the concepts. Some of the students that I spoke to in focus group discussions complained or mentioned how they'd been doing the exact same text over and over again since year 9, so for 3 or 4 years in repetition, and also how many of them didn't grasp the fundamental concepts. Similarly, teachers that I interviewed expressed frustration about how they felt that they weren't able to engage in this type of teaching because they were so focused on teaching students to the test and towards that performance-oriented approach that they felt they had no option but to deliver. So those are some of the key reflections that I observed.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.
You might have a very short question if it also leads to a very short response.
I mean, I was interested because coursework as such is not necessarily formative assessment. It's what the teacher does in the lesson and how they listen to what the candidates, you know, what they say. So it's an ongoing assessment, but not necessarily, because coursework can be summative too. So actually, when in the LGCSEs, when they had coursework assessment or controlled assignments, that was still summative assessment. It's not actually formative as such, but the repeating of things and all that kind of stuff and the pressure on that kind of thing, I think you illustrate very well. Students don't actually manage to, they don't feel any progress, which is the idea of formative assessment. Would you agree?
Yes, and thank you for the points on the coursework.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Dalby, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So first of all, like those before me, may I congratulate you, Gillian, on what I found to be a coherent and readable piece of writing, and something that I read with some interest, as you might expect. Now, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your methodology. So you have used quite a range of approaches to data collection and sampling, including the selection of a small sample of what you call ordinary and outlier colleges, which became quite key to your empirical work as nested case studies. Now, I'd like you to expand, if you can, on the selection of these colleges, since they're quite central to the thesis, particularly the criteria and the assumptions you made when selecting them. And following from that, I'd like you to think about your general approach to sampling and how that either strengthens or weakens the trustworthiness of your findings, bearing in mind that there are several sections of work here.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and also for your question, specifically your question to elaborate more on my method. As indicated, and as you also said, I sought data from a range of what I called ordinary or typical colleges. And then to complement that, I also sought examples from outlier colleges or outlier cases. I think before I explain about the method that I used to select the colleges, I'd like to first of all talk about the pre-method that went into the work before getting to the selection of the colleges, which involved some helicopter interviews with key experts, and there is precedent in the literature, and this type of research would advise for this type of approach to speak to some key experts to test the key ideas that I'm interested in exploring. So that was really critical. Second, I was keen to look into the literature, and particularly the education enactment literature, to see for other examples. And I'd noticed that the key study that I referenced earlier, the Ball, McGuire and Brown study, had also used ordinary colleges, although their selection criteria was a little different, ordinary schools, sorry, and their selection criteria was a little different. So I had to grapple with an existing approach, but also the fact that further education colleges are different to schools. There's far fewer of them, there's only about 300 of them in the country. And the sorts of tools that have been used in the schools literature, such as Ofsted ratings, results, things like that, some of those were useful, but also others of those indicators had to be interpreted with a bit of caution. For example, in the further education space, Ofsted inspections many of them haven't happened as frequently as in the school setting, and similarly, there's been a number of what's called mergers of colleges. So some of the colleges that had previously been inspected simply didn't exist as they had been merged into others. And so these were all things I had to grapple with. So I was keen to have colleges that had a fairly ordinary or representative approach in terms of results. And so from the public data on colleges, I was able to draw a shorter list, a list of about 20. And then from that, I worked with members of sector representative organisation to work through which of those would be convenient to visit. So it was a purpose of convenience sample within that ordinary group. And whilst some may then raise questions on, is there a link then with, is there a concern then on internal validity? In reality, this was an essential step for the research because colleges are real life institutions. They're very busy teaching students. They've got lots of things to do, and not just hosting researchers. Many of them were also hosting other types of research and other types of studies. So I wanted to make sure that I was able to do something, to approach colleges where I would actually get a response. So that helped narrow down the list. And so unsurprisingly, perhaps looking back on reflection, relatively average or ordinary colleges produced relatively normal results for the GCSE resits policy enactment. They were mostly performance oriented. And so then when I was coming to reflect, and again, there is precedence in the literature. I think in my method chapter, I referenced Martin Hadger, who explains this kind of iterative approach. So I was going back to see, well, how could I strengthen, and is there something further that needs to happen? And I was inspired by the qualitative methodologists such as Cresswell and Flyberg, who had commented on the idea of using outlier cases or extreme variation cases. So this then led me to think that I could add that step into the research to strengthen it. And so in order to find these extreme variations or these black swan cases, clearly I wasn't going to, it would be hard for me to find them just from a spreadsheet of results. So that is where I relied on speaking to members of the sector, and that's where some of my qualitative interviews were also helpful with sector representative organisations to find out, well, which colleges are doing this a little differently, and that then led me to source my outlier cases, which again has precedence in the literature. You specifically asked on my perspectives on the validity and how this approach, how I feel the validity is achieved through this approach. So as I indicated, I took a number of steps to try to secure the validity, and also to triangulate information from a range of sources. So yes, I drew data from these 3 ordinary further education colleges and then 2 outlier colleges. and students and staff in that. But before that, and also alongside that, I also interviewed approximately 20 members of the political executive and sector, and also teachers who weren't in those colleges. And in addition, I also conducted an online survey with key sector leaders and also with officials. And I was able to use all of that information alongside analysis of written texts and analysis of quantitative data, such as the JCQ data on examination entries.
Thank you. Thank
you. In order to strengthen the approach.
Corresponding more than excellent. I would like to give Professor Thomas and Professor Skills still also an opportunity to discuss with your research. The floor goes to Professor Thomas, who is from the University of Bristol and the School of Education over there. The floor is to Professor Thomas.
Hi, Gillian, and congratulations on your very nice presentation. I have to say, in my view, your study is a very ambitious and well-written thesis, definitely on an under-researched topic in the UK, the enactment of post-16 GCSE resits policy in FE colleges. It was a pleasure to read and I learned a lot, so thank you, Gillian. In terms of my question, I note your senior role in the DFE while conducting this research and also now, and also you noted yourself your closeness to the subject matter. So I wondered, could you tell us about the ethical issues that arose when you were conducting this research? And to follow on from that, also, how do you think the findings might have been different if you were not so close to the subject and you were not working at the DFE?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and also for your question, allowing me to reflect on the ethical issues and whether my findings would have been different if I hadn't been in the position that I am. I'll first of all speak on the ethical issues and then the second point. So this was certainly something that I was very aware of up front. So as a civil servant, I'm bound by what's called the Civil Service Code, and many others of us in Maastricht are international civil servants working with the UN or home civil servants in our own domestic civil service. So this is something that many of us have also faced. So not only being bound by the Civil Service Code, but also being, of course, keen to adhere to education and wider research ethical guidelines. So under the Civil Service Code, I was very minded on the need to ensure that my own work position did not influence the results and did not influence how I was approaching the research, and also that it didn't put people that I was interviewing in an uncomfortable position. Or might have helped, maybe they might have thought that something they said might lead to me making a direct change in the Department for Education or doing something in the Department for Education. So I was really keen to explain to them from the outset, whether it was from the survey, from my sector interviews, or from local college visits, that this was me as a researcher, and I was able to explain my role in Maastricht as a key difference to me as a civil servant. That being said, and I elaborate on this in the third chapter of my thesis, we are humans and researchers bring their own contexts to research, especially researchers who adopt constructivist perspectives or who believe that the social world is constructed and who are not adopting positivist perspective, as I wasn't. And so therefore, despite all the efforts and attempts to make me separate from the research process, I also cannot and could not do that because I was a critical part within that. And so following the advice of qualitative methodologists within that, I was keen. That was why I used so many different types of data sources, including data that I hadn't influenced as a participant. So that would be things like statistical sources, also direct quotes from Hansard, the government parliamentary record, and formal policy documents, people's contributions in writing to consultations. So things that had it didn't matter that I was there. Like I hadn't changed or influenced what they'd written. So that was really important to be able to bring that data in, to triangulate it with the data that I had sourced myself through interviews. I'll briefly answer your second question because I'm aware.
Please don't, because I know that you'll also respond to this in a very adequate way. But it would be a pity if Professor Schills, who's the last member of the degree committee, wouldn't have an opportunity to discuss your research. Professor Schills is a professor in economics of education at Maastricht University. The floor is now to Professor Schills.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, congratulations on your thesis. May I follow the other opponents? I think it's a very relevant topic, and we need to know more how policies are being translated into actions and interpreted. And I think your research shows where we should put our emphasis and our attention. I wanted to share some questions or some thoughts with you on more the aspects on the population that is targeted for this GCSE research policies, because it's usually the students that have low educational attainment. And the solution is, or the most enactment is, that it translates into performance-oriented and high-stakes testing. It could be that other elements of performance of students make them low attaining students. It's not just their ability. You mentioned the motivation already. And we know that there's more non-cognitive factors becoming more important for test performance and also for school performance, such as personality factors as conscientiousness or neuroticism, but also there's also the ability to prevent ego depletion and exhaustion. These are also important factors for test performance. And I was wondering, since your study shows that the research are basically focusing on the cognitive abilities of students, and this is the enactment of the policy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because it could be that the lack of these non-cognitive aspects is preventing the students from showing good performance, which they might have basically. But on the other hand, it could also be that these non-cognitive factors might also lead to failure later on in further education, and then the failure on the multiple resets is actually a good thing. And how does this also affect probably the selection of the colleges for the students that may do the resets? Do you have some ideas on this, on the importance of the non-cognitive aspects?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and for your question. First, on the non-cognitive aspects, you're right, in the GCSE assessment is one that focuses heavily on cognitive abilities. And although my research did not set out to look specifically at things such as motivational factors, that has already been addressed in the literature. But those aspects did present in my findings. So students very often described low confidence, feelings of failure, and also because of the system in the UK, many of them have made, all of them in further education, have made a very physical transfer from school into further education. So many of them were starting again in a new system with new teachers. For some of them, and linking to Bandura's theory on self-efficacy, that was a real opportunity to help motivate them, help give them that fresh start. But for others, this was a challenge, and this continued to hold them back. Your second point was on the students in the colleges themselves. I think it's important to flag that further education colleges take a range of students. It does have a comprehensive intake, and it can be quite different in different parts of the country. Some colleges might have perhaps the bottom half of the attainment profile based on the cognitive assessment of the GCSE examination at age 15, 16, and others might have the full range of students, just depending on the role that college played in the local town or in the country, the county where it is. So that would be how the population would differ based on that.
Any comments from Professor Schills? No.
Thank you.
That not being the case, then we still have 1 or 2 minutes. So the floor would then go for the second round to Professor Maguire, if she wants to, Professor Maguire. But you still have another observation or question.
Professor Maguire, you're on mute.
I'm very interested in the notion of the policy entrepreneur. And I'm wondering if it's not a policy entrepreneur, but it's policy entrepreneurship. And in terms of learning from institutional cultures, rather than individuals, as we talked about in our work. What would be your comment to that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this follow-up question. I think that I'm not convinced on a huge. I think that the difference between entrepreneur and entrepreneurship. So entrepreneur might indicate that they are being. No, I think that those two concepts would be relatively similar. So,
the hour has passed, but please conclude your reaction.
Thank you, Professor Maguire. So from my perspective, the concept of an entrepreneur versus being entrepreneurial, if you remove the business element of it, which I assume we are, I would say that they are relatively similar. I took inspiration from elements of your work and also from Lipsky's work on street level entrepreneurs and the expansion of that, particularly more recent expansion that's happening in the last couple of years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. McFarland. The time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company in the live stream await the results of our deliberations and our return.
Your microphone is muted, Pro-Rector. Sorry. Yes.
Apologies. Ms. McFarland, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense, and in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Bevere is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Congratulations, Gillian. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Gillian McFarland, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, affixed with the official seal of the university.
We now move the, first congratulations, of course. The Beadle's office and the PhD office will make sure that you will get the certificate. The floor is now to Dr. Bolante.
Before I share some remarks on Gillian and her work, I would like to once again congratulate her on a job well done in bringing her thesis to fruition. I would also like to thank the External Assessment Committee for graciously providing your time to assess and evaluate Gillian's research and being here today for this special event, which I am confident in saying is well deserved. Both Mark and I have been working with Gillian for the last 4 years. She has maintained a steadfast commitment to understanding the implications associated with particular educational policy options. In the case of her thesis, which has evolved substantially since our initial discussions, has been a desire to understand the impact, both positive and negative, of the GCSE resits policy in England. Gillian should be credited with recognizing how her own work experiences may potentially influence her interpretation of the findings, and has done an excellent job of recognizing these internal validity challenges when developing and ultimately implementing her data collection strategies and analysis techniques. At the same time, Gillian has shown a willingness to remain open to constructive criticism and make appropriate revisions along the way. I am confident in saying that I've had few, if any, graduate students that have refined the nature and scope of their study as many times as Gillian. The title changes alone surely numbered in excess of a dozen from start to finish. The latter shows the development and ongoing refinement of Gillian's thinking on this topic, as well as her willingness to consider alternative conceptual lenses to explain her results. Mark and I are particularly proud of the empirical contribution Gillian has made to the field of further education. As with any academic work, we hope Gillian's thesis informs ongoing and future policy debates in England, which is sure to continue on this important and timely topic. I would be remiss if I did not share some of Gillian's personal qualities that cannot be faithfully represented in her written work. Gillian is a genuine person who cares deeply about the children she represents. This quality is important, particularly for a person that works in a public policy field where reports, figures, and tables can often become detached from the challenges of individual pupils. Collectively, her organizational and analytic skills, coupled with her empathy for disadvantaged youth, are a healthy combination for those of us lucky enough to influence education policy. Mark and I, along with the entire GPAC community, wish her success in her future endeavors and encourage her to remain steadfast in her ability to question, interrogate, critique, and evaluate the policy choices that serve English children and pupils, Congratulations again, Gillian. Your success is a testament to your academic resilience in the face of challenging circumstances. Try not to wander too far, as future GPAC students would benefit from your insights. We wish you many successes in the future. Lastly, I would like to add one final point on behalf of the institution. Gillian, the GPAC staff has ordered an engraved art pen, including your name and date on it. In case we are able to offer it to you in person in June, we would love to do that and celebrate your degree belated in person. But minimally, we will send it to you as a well-deserved gift. Congratulations, Gillian.
Thank you. Dear Dr. McFarland, also on behalf of the Board of Deans of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the honor you have required. I would also like to congratulate both supervisors, and I would like to thank all members of the degree committee for attending and interestingly discussing your thesis. I hereby declare this ceremony to be ended.
Congratulations, Gillian. Nice work. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done, Gillian.